Ready to go, Madam Clerk? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The hour is 7 o'clock, and as mayor, I hereby call to order a special meeting of the Laconia City Council scheduled for October 1, 2018, to begin at this hour. As always, we'll begin our meeting with a salute to our American flag. I would ask that you please rise and join Councilor Robert Hamill in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. For the record, we'll note that the minutes to tonight's meeting are being kept by City Clerk Cheryl Hebert, and I would ask that she please call the roll.
Councilor Cheney?
Here.
Councilor Bounds?
Here.
Councilor Littman?
Present.
Councilor Haynes?
Here.
Councilor Hamill?
Present.
Councilor Hosmer?
Councilor Hosmer is absent this evening.
Mayor Engler?
Here. Let the record show that 5 of our 6 councilors are present tonight, and a quorum has been established for this meeting. Also note for the record that the council tonight is joined at the front table by City Manager Scott Myers. We have only one piece of business tonight for this special meeting, and that is a discussion of private roads under unfinished business. Since this is not a regular meeting, we don't, the official agenda does not include comment from the public, but I will tell you all now who are in attendance, I would ask your indulgence to listen to the presentation we're about to have and the questions the council may ask, and at the conclusion of that, we will be happy to accept public comment. All right, so we'll all get a chance to see what the staff is saying and recommending and whatnot, and then if any of you would like to comment on that, you'll be more than welcome to do so after the official presentation. Okay? So, Mr. Myers, how are we going to do this tonight?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, we've got Wes Anderson, our Public Works Director. We've got Carrie Roman, City's Legal Counsel. As the council and the public are well aware, we've been dealing with a number of roads that we cannot determine acceptance on the city's part for, and therefore, if they're not accepted formally, they're considered private roads, and you have different options of how you can treat private roads in terms of public tax dollars being spent on them. Through some of the presentations we've had, we've identified approaches for certain roads. Tonight, we've got a presentation that we think will satisfy a large number of those roads that are kind of in the gray area. They've always been treated as public roads, but through our research, we can't track any formal acceptance. And these are roads that clearly have not been determined to be private roads. So that's where we're going to start tonight. We think it's a good approach. It does include some buy-in from abutters on these particular streets going forward, but we think it's an opportunity to allow for a continued level of service and some continued maintenance on these streets, and kind of takes them out of the gray area permanently. So with that, I would turn it over to Wes to start us off, and then Carrie will be joining in shortly.
Thank you. I'm going to lead off, and Carrie will be joining us about slide 3. Okay, let's get us going. Are we up?
Black right now.
Showing up on my screen.
Yep.
Okay. So tonight we're talking about private roads. Just as a reminder, this is how many roads by type that we have in the city. The roads that we're talking about tonight are the problematic roads, the 9 miles. The 16 miles includes things like Southdown, Long Bay, Briarcrest, Wildwood. The options you've already seen, private road, emergency lanes, and the betterment process. So what we're really focusing on tonight is a new concept that we have called Accept As Is. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie at this point.
Thank you, Wes. Again, I'm Carrie Roman, Legal Counsel from Mitchell Municipal Group. I'm too short, so if you can't hear me, just let me know and we'll work on that. So accepting a road as is, the city can do that. It's a little bit unusual just because usually when you accept a road and take it over as a city-maintained road, it's usually for purposes of upgrading that road to Class 5 standards. So expanding it, plowing it, grading it, but you don't have to do that. You can accept roads as they are, as is, and you can maintain them that way. I wanted to give a little bit of guidance about what that means in terms of liability, because that's the risk when you accept a road as is. Because the city, once you take over a road and it becomes a city-owned road, you have an obligation to maintain the road in a safe manner. And what that obligation means is it has to be passable safely by persons walking and by vehicles traveling. And those are persons and vehicles that normally travel those roads. So of course, if you have a back road and all of a sudden you have a major double-decker bus going down there and there's an accident, that's not what I mean. I mean traditional travel that's expected along those roads. As long as you maintain the road in a sufficient manner that can be, those types classifications of people and vehicles can pass by safely, then you will not have any liability in terms of if someone gets injured or if a vehicle is damaged, a pothole, something along those lines. So the only thing with taking a road as is you're increasing your liability a little bit, of course, because when you have a road as is that you're not grading and bringing up to Class 5 standards, you are going to have higher incidence of potholes. You are going to have higher incidence of the edge of the road falling, to the side. I don't know if any of these roads are dirt. You don't have to pave them if you accept them as is, but again, you just have to make sure that you're maintaining them to a level that they're safely passable. Now, there's a further protection for the city that you can also only be held liable, even for these types of roads that are older and maintained as is, if several things. You have to have been given notice that there was a problem on the road. So let's say there's a huge pothole and that's dangerous for cars or people to travel on one of these roads. If no one in the city was given notice, and there's a specific way that notice has to be given, it can't just be given to any city employee. There's a process that has to be followed. If you weren't given notice, or if it's something that's the matter with the road that does not constitute gross negligence or reckless disregard for safety on the part of the city, as long as there's no intentional act. No one went out there from the city and dug a pothole. As long as those three things aren't met, there's no liability on the part of the city. So you are fairly well insulated. You're further insulated on these roads as is, that if there's any kind of damage to the roads because of weather. Now, of course, that's important given where we live, that if a weather situation, let's say a snowstorm, causes some sort, or flooding of some sort, causes damage to the road, as long as you have a weather maintenance policy in place, which I can work with Wes on developing, and as long as you follow that policy, whenever there's any sort of weather situation that damages the road, and it could create a very dangerous situation, but as long as you have a weather policy and you're following it, again, there's no liability for these roads. So it's a little riskier than bringing a road up to Class 5 standards, but you are fairly well insulated, and in my opinion, as long as the roads that you would be taking over in this fashion are fairly well known and Public Works is confident about how they're maintained and the status of them, legally I have no concern about the city taking over those roads. But it'll, of course, depend on a case-by-case basis. So I just wanted to go over briefly what the process would look like for taking over these roads. You have, as a council, you have to be petitioned in order to take over a road. You can only need one petitioner. It could be anybody who lives in the city. It could even be a councilor. And it doesn't have to look a certain way. There's no format that's required. It just is essentially saying I request that the city lay out XYZ road from this point to that point. It's very simple. And then you would have a public meeting, not a public hearing at that point, but a public meeting for a brief discussion about whether that's something the council wanted to move forward on. And if you did, it would go to the planning board, because the planning board by statute has to weigh in. They don't get ultimate say, but they do get a recommendation, and their recommendation matters because if they don't approve it, then you need a larger majority to pass it at your level. So it would have to go to the planning board if first, before it came back to you to make a final decision. Now, there's an exception to that, and some of these roads would qualify under this exception that I'm about to give you. If any of these roads are on a recorded plat at the registry, then you don't need to go to the planning board. And I believe some of them are, Wes. Yeah, okay.
When
So
you
the
say-
ones that are on a planning board approval,
When you say petition, is that one person?
yes. Oh, let me back up 1 minute. The reason why, where I have their council public meeting, that's a little bit of an extra step that I've added for this particular situation. And I've done that because I wanted the council to have the opportunity to have some discussion about how abutters to each of these individual roads feel about the city taking over these roads as is. And the reason for that is when you lay out a road, and that means when you're taking over a road as a city-owned road, under the statute, the city is required to pay damages to the people who live on either side of the road. And it's called damages because essentially it's a taking. You see people who live on either side of a private road, in some cases own to the middle of that road, and in other cases, some of these roads themselves are owned by a former developer or someone else that took over these roads unknowingly. Whoever under the law has ownership of the road, and when it's unknown, it's assumed to be the abutters, and you do a layout of a city road over it, that's essentially a taking. So the law requires that damages be paid, just like if the city took over a piece of property by eminent domain. Now, where the roads already exist in these cases, the damages are, number one, very, very minimal, and number two, I always counsel towns and cities that if they're going to go forward with that sort of process, they request in writing that the abutters be willing to waive damages. Because if you're maintaining a road and adopting it as a city road, that's a huge advantage to the abutters. So that's not something I generally would recommend a town or city do unless the abutters are willing to waive damages. And that's very common. That happens a lot in regards to taking over a private road. So that's why I put that extra initial piece of a public meeting, which you can have public comment at or not, to discuss whether or not you'd be willing to take over some of these roads, understanding that if you did not get waivers, the city would have to pay minimal damages. Are there any questions on that piece?
Counselor Lippman has a question.
Not discounting what you just said about the waiving of damages, but the council itself wanted to petition and was secured the waivers. Is that an acceptable process?
Yes. It is, absolutely. If it goes to the planning, oh yes, Counselor.
Before you go on, just a general question. I take it at this time that we do not have a weather maintenance policy, that we would have to develop a new one?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I'm not surprised that you don't, because this is the type of situation where you would be required to have one, where you have roads that you're maintaining in Class 5 standards. You don't really it's a good thing to have, but before you start adopting taking over these roads, that's something you absolutely will want to have.
And that would be something that the council would adopt?
Yes.
Okay.
Mayor? You mentioned you've counseled other cities and towns about damages. Do you have some idea of what they generally, what sort of numbers we're talking about for damages?
So I've only had one where it actually went to paying out of damages, because all of the others, the abutters all waived damages. And on that one, it was, how long was it? 1,000 feet. That's how long the road was. And I believe the total damages were a little over 3,000. And I can't recall specifically how many people lived on that road. I want to say it was at least 7, but it was no more than 15. But I can't remember specifically.
Thank you.
But that was the one in the many, many, many circumstances I've done that. It's so rare. And you have to,
So the total damages were
Yes.
3,000?
yes.
Is it a possibility to ask for a waiver, and if we don't get a waiver, just not to do the as-is process?
That's right. So what I had contemplated, and I worked with your city manager and with Wes, is a letter that would go out to the abutters of some of these roads that essentially asks for them to give their thoughts up front before you get too far down this process. And it's like a checkbox. Yes, we want the city to consider taking over the road. Yes, we understand it would be as is. Yes, we would be willing to waive damages, or no. And then when the city gets those letters back, you can then decide how you want to proceed road by road.
From our opinion, there was no sense going to try to do an as-is layout if the majority of the abutters had no interest in doing it.
Right. And if there's 15 people on the road and only one of them wants damages, are we obligated to pay everybody or just that one?
Just that one if you get waivers from everybody else. When it either comes back from planning board, or if some of these, it doesn't have to go to planning board because it's already been approved on a plat, you have to schedule a public hearing, and you have to give notice to the petitioner, and you have to give notice to whomever lives on either side of the road, and in some cases, the potential owner of these roads, because we can't ascertain for sure, is not the abutters. It's some other person, a developer or some entity of the developer. But essentially, you have to give notice to all persons that would be interested or have an interest in this laying out process. It includes mortgage holders, so it is a little bit of a process because you have to do title searches on some of these properties. So you'd have to do it pretty methodically, but we can certainly help with that. And a title search is not a big deal. It's just an added step. At the public hearing, this is another big piece, and there's no way around it, unfortunately. The council has to take a view of the road, and you can't designate that to Public Works. So each road, you have to go and view it. Even though we know where it is, and it's a private road that's already there, it's just what the state law requires.
Do we have to do it in a public session, or can we go on a Monday morning and take a look at it and say?
In a public session.
Okay.
You don't have to do it in a public, this is all part of the public hearing. You can take a view in just a public meeting part of it. You don't have to take comments during that time, so you're not there all day, but you do have to have it
We would need to go
open,
as a group. So if you did 50 streets, you'd have to go visit 50 streets.
unfortunately.
Bus tour. I think you're going to see later on, if this process moves forward, we're trying to address certain neighborhoods over the next year or two, so we probably would be breaking them down into those types of manageable sections. We can go out and look at 8 or 10 roads in one fell swoop and kind of knock them off.
But during a meeting.
A posted meeting that we would start here, and then the meeting would go visit these various roads, yes.
So that would only require a quorum.
That's right.
So and while this process
And
was,
why do you suggest that?
go ahead.
He volunteered.
Counselor Hamel.
Say a road is privately owned by an individual, and he's not in the area, and the people who live on the road want to do this. How can that happen if you can't get hold of the person?
There's a statutory process for notifying someone that's either a non-resident or someone that you can't find. And so I apologize, I don't have that right off the top of my head, but there is a process to do that because I think the legislators must have anticipated that happens in New Hampshire. So it's specifically, there's a way to do that.
Go ahead.
And I just want to mention, when you do the view, I have it here under your public hearing. You don't have to do it as part of the ultimate public hearing about adopting the road. You could always, as long as you take a view at some point before the final vote, that's allowed. Obviously, it's a public hearing, so the abutters and any owners and anybody interested, so tenants I have here, holders of mortgages, they get to speak at the public hearing. You have discussion, and you have to make specific findings, which I would provide to you. But essentially, what the specific findings are requiring is a balance. You can't just say we want to have the road, so we're going to lay it out. There has to be a public need for the road that outweighs the private benefit to the folks who live there. And it sounds like a little bit of, it's an odd test because you can always find that there's a public need for a road, but things like you want to make sure your fire trucks can get down there. You want to make sure that everybody in the city has access to other parts of city roads if they've been maintained already, that sort of thing. But I would give you that language that you could consider. But you have to do that weighing, and you have to make a specific finding. And that's something I would give for you.
Counselor Hamel has a question, please.
The way you're explaining this, what would be the difference between an emergency way and accept as is?
So I'm a big fan of emergency lanes, and I'm a big fan of it because it allows you to maintain roads to a certain degree, because the maintenance is supposed to be for public safety purposes, that you can get ambulances and fire trucks down there, so you have some limitations. That said, many municipalities use emergency lanes to maintain roads they've been already maintaining, and as long as you have some reason to link getting a fire truck down there, you can use the emergency lane statute. I like it because it gives you a lot of leeway and authority, that you can have the road plowed, you can have the road repaired, and if you ever not want to do it anymore, you just vote not to do it. That's the end of it. It's not a road that becomes a city road. It's still a private road, but you can use funds at your discretion to maintain or repair it. The problem with an emergency lane statute is that if anyone who lives on the road is not in favor of you adopting it as an emergency lane, one person can shoot the whole thing down. You have to have unanimous support on that road for an emergency lane.
So so as is, the city actually accepts the road.
And so it becomes, and that's the other thing, is with an emergency lane, there's no liability at all. And with a acceptance, it's now a city road, there is some liability there, as we had discussed.
So the emergency lane would also take care of the problem if the abutter's owned to the center line.
That's right,
So you wouldn't have to mess with that either.
that's right.
Counselor Levin?
You mentioned about unanimous for an emergency lane. Is that at the time or ongoing?
Ongoing. So anyone along that road can revoke their permission to have it emergency lane, and then that's it, it's over.
And the same could hold true with the city council, could come in at a different time, a different council could say, we no longer want to, identify those as emergency lanes and pull it out. So this would put some permanency for the residents on those streets.
So we declare an emergency lane, and 2 years later, somebody says, not me. That's it.
That's it.
Okay?
It doesn't happen that often. It's because emergency lane is a nice win-win in most situations, but it's just not as permanent, and it creates a situation where you'll be seeing it again and again. And so if you're inclined to stick it out through the process, adopting these roads as city roads, and as long as you get the waivers for damages, is a logical process to follow. That said, if you don't get the waivers for damages, you don't likely want to be in a position of having to pay out damages. It doesn't create a legal precedent, but it could create a precedent. Then emergency lane is something you could fall back on as an alternative.
Counselor Levin?
I presume the waiver, once given, remains in effect?
That's right. And it would carry over to future owners of the property.
Counselor Hamel?
How many situations have you had with the emergency lane that someone rebuffed it
At the time or later on?
later on?
None.
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 How about at the time?
At the time, I've had several, maybe 10, but I've done a lot, where there were towns tried to do emergency lanes, and there were one or several people that were not interested in having, they just, there were large swaths of land, farmland, they just weren't interested in having government come out and plow or maintain the road.
So right at the beginning then, to try and make it an emergency lane, they did not want it.
That's right.
But once
I've never had anyone revoke it.
once it was in.
And I've been doing this for a decade, almost a decade.
So once the emergency lane was accepted, you haven't had one that,
I haven't, no. If the road in question had to go to the planning board, so if it wasn't on a plat that was approved and went to recorded at the registry, and the planning board approved it, gave their approval, then you only need a majority vote of council members. If the planning board disapproved it, you need 2/3 vote. So that's the reason for the planning board. It's a little bit of a technicality, but this comes back to the damages. I just reiterate what I had said previously about getting waivers, and that would be something we already have a form for it, what it would look like, the waiver, it's pretty straightforward. And then you take a vote with the findings that I would give you, and if it was voted in favor, there's a one-page return that states the layout of the road and it adopts it as a city road, and it's filed with the city clerk, and then it's yours.
Is there any process that would require filing with the registry or anything like that, or is it just to the
No.
city clerk? Okay.
I should mention that in addition to, it doesn't seem like the city would go this way, but if you did, if you were paying damages to folks, if that situation came up, people can, and you made a decision about how much you were willing to pay in damages, that decision is final in terms of you're not in a constant negotiation until you agree. You get to make the final decision about how much the damages would be. However, folks that are entitled to the damages can appeal that to the Superior Court. So I just want to raise that's why I shy away from, if you don't get waivers, I'm not inclined to have roads adopted, because it just can be a drawn-out process.
Counselor Hamel?
Just touching on that point of paying damages. So if you accept it as is that what you're talking about? That
Yes.
could pay damages?
I'm sorry, when I say damages, I mean, that's what the statute calls them. I mean eminent domain damages. So damages in terms of, we're now, essentially the city is placing city property on top of private property. Those are the damages I refer
Not
to.
talking about damage to the road from a rainstorm now.
No, you will not, and except in gross negligence, willful recklessness, or given notice of a dangerous condition that you ignored, you would not have to pay damages.
So, but we would be responsible for any repairs to those roads.
And I mean repairs that are major, if these roads have potholes, you're not obligated to fill that. It's, and I've talked with Wes about what these roads look like, and for the most part, there may be a few exceptions. Their current status is fine, the way they are now.
But aren't we talking about roads here that we already presumed we did have that
And
responsibility for?
maintain, yes.
I don't know.
I mean, largely, that's what we're talking about.
That is largely what
roads
you're
that
talking about.
We always thought were public roads that turned out not to be public roads.
And I don't believe you're repairing all of them. It's mostly the plowing, but except for a few circumstances and things that I can't predict in the future, it wouldn't be much more than likely what you're doing.
And by as-is means if a road is in poor condition today, doesn't mean we never would go on it and do any maintenance. As-is basically is how it was constructed. So if it was asphalt on a glorified cow path with no drainage system built into it, we will continue to put asphalt down and keep it in passable condition, but the residents shouldn't be expecting the city's going to come in and tear that up and put it in a proper base and put it in all the drainage system. So it doesn't mean we wouldn't go down there and take care of these roads as dollars allowed in our paving maintenance program. It just means kind of how they're built and how we agree to accept them. Everyone's on board that these are not at city specs, and it's not the city intention ever to go up and bring them up to those city specs completely on our dime.
Unless it were part of some
Some
grand plan or something.
Unless it was something bigger or a betterment, which is something we're not going to get into too much tonight, but is a further option that is not precluded of betterment
But in effect,
programs.
what you're saying is, I think, that the city would take the same responsibility for it that it has had for the last forever years.
Yes,
Nothing would change.
right.
Counselor
I got two questions. I guess one is
Can
for
you move
Wes.
the mic in front of you, please?
I guess two questions. One is for Wes, or the city manager. If we decided to go forward with this as-is process or declaring emergency lanes process, I assume that the same policy that we've adopted already in terms of maintenance would remain in place until we completed the process. Is that right?
Actually, I'll answer that question further on down the presentation, because it depends upon another couple of issues that you'll see as we go through how that's handled.
Okay. And on the estimated cost, it says, estimated cost for the layout's $100,000.
Correct.
Tell me where that figure comes from, and,
Basically, we've done some boundary line adjustments in the last few years, and I've used what it costs us for those boundary line adjustments to get sort of a rough figure of what it's going to take to lay out. Because basically, we are making a survey of where that road is to go into the document for the layout.
and you're not talking about $100,000 for each road, you're talking about an overall
Correct.
cost of $100,000.
That's what I'm anticipating right now. As we go through the process, we'll get a better estimate. But okay. Anything else?
No.
Okay. So as it sits right now, we have 54 problematic roads in the city. If we go through and accept the as-is, if we accept the as-is road as an option, my analysis is we can accept 33 of them using that method. We still would have 11 roads that I believe would be potentially in support. We have Pendleton Beach and Boathouse, which will be coming up at our next council meeting in regards to a request to have that declared an emergency lane. There's one that a developer is looking at building a development at the far end of it. And one of the requirements that the planning board has put upon him is to bring that up to city standards. So that one would be off the table. And state-wise, I think there'll still be 4 roads that will be emergency lanes and will only be emergency lanes until other things can happen to them. And then there's 3 that we have to continue research on them because I don't even have good enough to make a recommendation on them at this point.
Does your list include the roads we declared emergency lanes
Correct.
last year?
So some of those ones we declared last year, I'm including in the accept as is. So at the end state, we only have 4 emergency lanes, possibly 2 more depending upon what the council decides to do with Pendleton Beach and Boathouse. Layout and return, again, I have no estimated costs for the return or the damages portion. All of my costs or analysis is based off of what it's going to take to actually lay out, saying this is where the road is and putting the appropriate markers up to it. That is not a final estimate. That is based off some assumptions that we made, and that estimate would get tighter as we go through the process. Conceptual timeline, there's no way we can do this in 1 year. So I sort of grouped it into areas where the Weirs Beach area, which would be Lucerne, the Methodist campground area, some other roads up in there. Target to have that complete by September of next year. The Lakeport area, May of 2020. Downtown area, the fall of that year. And then the west side of the city, the Winnisquam area, the year after that. And that's just because of the time it's going to take to survey it and go through the process.
That's included in these roads here, right, Wes?
Correct. There are some policies that we're going to have to establish. We already have a couple on board. One is the maintenance standards for emergency lanes, and one is the building on private roads. The ones that we're going to have to develop is the maintenance standards for as-is layout roads. If we accept some roads as emergency lanes with exceptions, Pendleton Beach, Boathouse, we'll have to develop a policy as it applies to that or any other road with exceptions. And then we need to consider which roads that we don't want as emergency lanes or as we don't want to consider for as-is. And you can see an initial list there, the gated communities, the private roads that have been approved by a planning board like Briarcrest, Wildwood, those that we may have an excessive cost of providing that support. And then there's the, yes,
Could you speak to that cost of providing support is excessive if we've already been including it in our,
part of the issue, and I can give you the best example, is what we sit right now is Colonial and Plantation. We are doing it after every rainstorm, heavy rainstorm, we have to go out and regrade the road because it has no drainage system and it's steep. We can keep doing it, but it's not a benefit to the property owners. It's just giving them access. Eventually, that road is going to need major work. So that's something that we need to take care of either through the betterment process or something else, so we don't put ourselves into a situation where the residents are at some point are stuck. Does that answer that question?
yes, thank you.
Okay. And condo association entrances. That,
Has there been any discussion with the people on Plantation?
we're actually meeting with them this Friday.
With who?
Plantation, Colonial.
And just one thing that I say a lot is through this whole process, we are not discontinuing service, maintenance, plowing, any of that right now for anything, for the foreseeable future. So we are working, with the property owners on these streets. And again, no one is cut off this winter. So just keep stressing that.
Potential end support, I didn't catch that.
Okay, let me go back. That includes Plantation and Colonial. An attorney for the development of the Christmas Island area, the new condos that were put there, did a lot of research and determined that Prescott Avenue, the main entrance in, is private. And then all the roads that are off of that are private. So that's one of the things we would have to work through. It's more closely to some of the other roads in. So that's a potential to end support in that area, and there's a couple others through there.
So potential to end city maintenance support to it because they're private and they've been determined to be private.
Okay.
Is Is that where a majority of these little side roads are off of, for that end support thing?
This does include Plantation and Colonial, includes Prescott, Paugus, and the other roads that are in that area. And I have to look at the list for the others. But most of them are either very poorly constructed, they're off of a private road, or in certain circumstances, there's only one house on the road, and we're actually plowing someone's driveway because the road was never built. Other questions?
Questions, discussion?
I can just recap briefly. We did have a meeting down at the Weirs Community Center a week ago Friday.
Week ago Friday.
Week ago Friday, had a very good turnout. Had a lot of folks from the Methodist camp down where we kind of gave them a preview of this and indicated this would be an approach we'd be considering and presenting to the council. A couple of the neighbors down there have already started, prior to this, grabbing some petitions. So it seems like there's strong support from the majority, if not all, of the streets that we've targeted down there by folks wanting the city to accept them in some way, shape, or form. So I know a few of them are here tonight, and they certainly will have an opportunity to speak, but we were pleased with the turnout of 40 or 50 people. We held it on a Friday night just so that people who were up for the weekend, could make the meeting if they chose to. But we felt very good after that meeting, and I think there were a lot of positive comments by a number of the folks who attended as well.
All right, so I'm going to open this to the public, and then after the public has spoken, we'll bring it back to ourselves to see if there's any.
Could I ask one last question?
Sure.
I've heard in prior discussions the term fire lane bandied about. Is fire lane the same thing as?
No, fire lane is another separate terminology for basically keeping parking lots or whatever open. So the fire.
What did Moultonborough call their?
They actually did emergency lanes.
Emergency
But they
lanes.
used it for fire reasons.
Fair enough. Thank you.
All right, the floor is open to any of you who wish to address the council on these matters. You would identify yourself by name and what street you live on, please.
My name is Mary Lee Hovanian. I live on Morris Ave. And first of all, I'd like to thank the support that the people that I contacted were of, tremendous help. Because the first thing when I heard that, there was going to be a question about roads is, how do I get them accepted? Turns out the city already owns us. That's how much I knew. But in favor, talking to my neighbors, which I met a lot of new neighbors, and I was amazed at the turnout and the support. And this is before we knew of any of this. We want to change. We want, as you say, no one knows who owns what little part of the road. This is my parking space over there. That's mine over there. A road coming down the street with, even if it's only 5, 6, 7, 2, or 3, it doesn't matter the amount, should be accessible to all people, for whatever reason, going over that road. And the best way to, for that to happen is to get the road accepted. At least that's a little bit of research that I did, but I think you all did an excellent job explaining it to the people that came. And I'd like to thank you and Wes and your lovely secretary, Nancy. So that's all I have to say. And I hope you go forward with this, because I think if you address it positively to the constituents, I think you're going to get people liking the thought of, by golly, you can point out to them, they don't have to pay taxes on that road that they own half of anymore. You may not be paying them, but in essence, you are. So there are some very positive aspects, and I think as positive as you've been with us, I'd like to see the rest of the neighborhoods come up with the same response. Now, would you like to hire me as the PR man? Thank you very much for letting me address you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Okay, who's next?
My name is Robert Ewell. My wife and I own 21, 23, and 23 Allen Avenue. And I just want to say that it's really encouraging to hear the report tonight. The four abutters in our road are all ready to sign waivers, and it's just really good to see it looks like the city's going to do the right thing in this situation. Thank you.
Where is your road, can I just ask?
If you go over the wooden bridge,
Okay. Oh, you're in
over the
Methodist.
wooden bridge, a left and an immediate right, so we're next to Methodist Circle.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Eric Rowley, 17 Kingsley Ave, and I'm all for the as-is. And, you know, the road hasn't been maintained very well, but I like that because people have to go slow. What is it, emergency lane? I think that's kind of shortchanging us. I mean, we're part of Laconia. We pay property taxes. Most of the people in our neighborhood don't have kids in the school system, and we contribute to it. And I don't mind. But I would resist the emergency lane.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? Okay, we'll bring it back to council then. Next step.
So next step would be, obviously, discussion tonight, and if there's consensus to place this on a future agenda to have the council support, and as is policy for staff and I to be working on, and we can start further fleshing out, some of the documents in the process for you, and start putting some, firmer dates on how we're going to approach and where we're at and who our first contacts are going to be with. But we didn't want to get too far ahead of ourselves until we got direction for tonight's meeting.
Councilor Cheney, would you like to make a motion?
I would. I'd like to move that the council adopt an as-is policy and program. Also ask that council develop whatever policies, thank you, will be necessary to assure we have the maintenance stuff in place. Complicated, sorry.
This is like a hearing in Washington. You have your attorney here to whisper in your ear. what you're saying.
I have to turn my hearing aids up, sir.
I'm going to second that motion.
All right, Councilor Ballin seconds that motion. Did you get a decent interpretation there of what the motion is? All right. Any discussion? Councilor Lippman.
Yes, I'd like to help facilitate to the extent that it's practical of the council taking the initiative where we can to move this along and get it done and create certainty for the public with respect to what their road is. I know if people are trying to sell property or whatever, it may have some value, impact on the value or make a transaction more complex.
If we had a list of the roads, would it just be to have each councilor sponsor the petition, the roads in their ward, and be done with it, right?
I'm for getting it done. Obviously, if there's a $100,000 cost that we haven't got planned in the budget, we have to maybe moderate it for that issue, but I think we can probably absorb it over a couple budgets.
Absolutely, and I think part of it isn't so much the staff time, it's the actual go out and lay out the corners and doing the survey work to it. So that component has to be in there. And we have to do some of the notification to the abutters and have them sign off on it and get those forms back. We've spoke at the meeting, and maybe some of the streets could have, team captains or something, and kind of, encourage their neighbors that if they haven't sent their forms back to, get them back to us to help facilitate the process as well. But, and as Carrie laid out, there are some procedural steps that we've got to arrange to get out there and, physically view them and hold a public hearing and refer to the planning board certain roads. So just some of those procedures are going to take time. But if there's strong support for this, we can do everything that we can to expedite it, just knowing that it's not going to be wrapped up in 2 or 3 months just for the reasons that I've stated. But certainly a work in progress.
All right, any other discussion?
I just want to thank Wes and Carrie for their presentations and working towards a resolution that's going to address these problems, not just short-term, but long-term. So, and thank you all for your concerns.
Anyone else? All right, we're going to vote on Counselor Cheney's motion then. All in favor, please raise a hand. 5 votes in the affirmative, the motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you.
Could I make it, or ask a question, Mayor? I believe there was a comment made that that a person or persons need to petition the council to accept the road. I wonder if it'd be in order to make a motion to start the process to accept the 33 roads listed by Wes. No?
I probably would rather do that in a formal agenda item where it's noticed as to what the roads are so that folks are aware of it versus us doing something that blanket this evening just for public input if it
But I
need
do
be.
think, unless one of you or more objects, I do think the simplest way to get this going would be to have each counselor sponsor the petition for the roads on that list and their wards.
We can put that together and get it to each counselor as to which ward,
Or
you
just
know,
pass, you know.
which roads are in the ward, get it to you, and we can put it on the agenda to have that move forward.
The as-is, though, we have to go visit those, correct?
No, after it comes back from
We're
the
just
planning
starting the
board.
process.
We're gonna
So
get
we
the
just start-
process going
We'll
first.
just start the process
Yeah.
by doing the petition for,
We don't have to visit it until it comes
Particular
back from the
roads.
planning board.
for some people, it's a lot of work.
We're about to get some legal advice here.
The petition has to be in writing, but it just can say, I, so-and-so of such and such road, petition for these roads to be adopted. That's it, one sentence. And I can give that language to you because we already have it for others.
Say I have 5 roads in
Just
Ward
have 6 of them with each counselor's
Exactly.
listed underneath them.
That's fine.
If I have 5 roads in Ward 2, I can just write one petition.
That's right.
As to all 5 roads.
Yes.
And that'll do.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll just send you a blank and you could just fill in the blanks.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. Any other business come for council tonight? If not, I will declare the meeting adjourned at 7:47 PM. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, we have 2 non-meetings tonight, 1 non-meeting to go over collective bargaining topics.